By the winter of 1944, the war that Adolf Hitler had unleashed upon Europe had turned full circle. The mighty Wehrmacht, once unstoppable in its advance across the continent, was collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. To the east, the Red Army was pouring across Poland and the Baltic, reclaiming land with a fury born from vengeance. To the west, a new kind of enemy had emerged, one the Germans had underestimated, mocked, and misunderstood. The Americans had come. And with them came a power unlike anything the German soldier had ever encountered, a combination of industrial might, logistical genius, and a relentless will to win. At first, many in the German high command regarded the American presence with scorn. The propaganda of Joseph Goebbels painted the Americans as soft, factory workers and farmers unfit for the brutality of European warfare. They were, according to the Nazi image, materialistic and naive, incapable of matching the battle-hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht. Yet when the Western Front erupted after the Normandy landings in June 1944, that illusion shattered. The Americans did not fight like the Russians, nor did they fight like the British. They fought with overwhelming firepower, coordination, and speed. They did not throw men at a problem, they buried it under artillery, tanks, and aircraft. To the average German soldier, the first encounters with the Americans were confusing. The enemy appeared in endless waves of machines, Sherman tanks, jeeps, half-tracks, and bombers that blotted out the sun. The skies above France and Belgium thundered day and night as Allied planes destroyed supply lines, railways, and communication centers. The German front, starved of fuel and ammunition, began to collapse not only from attack but from suffocation. American logistics were so immense that even after days of continuous battle, fresh supplies arrived from the beaches, flowing like lifeblood through an industrial vein that stretched all the way back to the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. To the men in gray uniforms who had fought from Moscow to Normandy, this realization was chilling. The Americans could not be exhausted. German officers began to notice something else. American soldiers, though young and often inexperienced, were adaptable. They learned fast. Their units operated with flexibility and initiative, traits that the rigid German command structure had long suppressed. In the U.S. Army, a sergeant could make a battlefield decision that in the Wehrmacht would require approval from a colonel. This freedom gave the Americans an agility that stunned their enemies. They could respond to chaos with order, and they could transform setbacks into opportunity. What the Germans saw as disorder was, in fact, a new form of warfare, decentralized, dynamic, and democratic. By late summer, after the breakout from Normandy, German troops found themselves retreating through the ruins of France. The Americans were everywhere, on the roads, in the skies, in the forests. Villages that had been under German occupation for 4 years now welcomed columns of olive-drab tanks and trucks rolling eastward. For the first time, the German soldier began to see what he was truly up against. The American war machine was not just a military force, it was a civilization in motion. It had no single face, no singular ideology, but behind every weapon and every uniform was a factory, a family, a nation united in purpose. And that purpose was total victory. When the Allies closed in on the German border in the autumn of 1944, something changed deep within the German psyche. Reports circulated among the frontline units, stories of how fairly the Americans treated their prisoners, how food was given, how discipline was maintained. The soldiers of the U.S. Army were not driven by hatred or ideology, they fought as professionals. To a German soldier who had spent years on the Eastern Front, watching comrades slaughtered or mutilated by the brutal Soviet advance, the idea of surrendering to Americans was not simply practical, it was survival. Word spread quickly through exhausted regiments, better to fall to the Americans than to face the Russians. The difference was stark. To the east, the Red Army was avenging 2 years of destruction, massacre, and humiliation. Every German who fought on that front knew what awaited them if captured, retribution without mercy. The Soviets saw the German soldier not as an opponent but as a monster to be purged. But on the Western Front, the Americans were something else entirely, cold, efficient, impersonal. They fought hard, they killed decisively, but they did not indulge in cruelty. When German prisoners were marched into captivity under the Stars and Stripes, they received food, cigarettes, and blankets. It was not kindness in the sentimental sense, it was discipline, and that discipline created trust. The Wehrmacht, for all its pride, recognized professionalism when it saw it.by the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, the German army was already fracturing under the strain. Hitler's last gamble in the Ardennes was a desperate attempt to break the American line, to divide the Allies and rekindle the spirit of Blitzkrieg. For a brief moment, it worked. The fog, the snow, and the element of surprise gave German panzer divisions the illusion of revival. But the Americans did not collapse. They bent, regrouped, and counterattacked with a ferocity that stunned even veteran German officers. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of American defiance, where outnumbered paratroopers refused to yield, encircled but unbroken. The German soldiers who witnessed it saw something familiar, a will to fight to the end, but something unfamiliar, too, a will tempered by reason, not fanaticism. As the German army retreated once more, surrender became less an act of shame and more an act of sanity. The American advance was methodical, precise, and unstoppable. Armored columns rolled through shattered villages while P-47 Thunderbolts prowled above like metallic hawks, destroying anything that moved under the German cross. In this mechanized hell, surrender became a form of liberation. For tens of thousands of German soldiers, the choice was simple: to die for a regime that was already crumbling, or to live under an enemy that treated captives with order and restraint. By the spring of 1945, the floodgates opened. On the Western Front, entire divisions laid down their arms before the advancing Americans. In some cases, German commanders sought out U.S. units, waving white flags, pleading to be captured before the Soviets could reach them. The number swelled until 500,000 German soldiers surrendered in a matter of weeks. Fields across Germany turned into temporary prison camps, vast enclosures of wire and mud where men who had once fought for the Reich now sat beneath the same sky, silent and relieved. They had not surrendered out of cowardice. They had surrendered because they understood that the war was over, and that facing the Americans was not defeat, but deliverance from annihilation. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht, once symbols of terror, were now refugees from their own nation's ruin. And in that transformation lay the first step toward understanding why 500,000 German soldiers chose the Americans, because they feared death under ideology more than captivity under order. The Americans, in their vast impersonal efficiency, represented something paradoxically humane: the power of civilization over chaos. As 1945 dawned, Germany stood on the edge of extinction. From the skies came the unending hum of Allied bombers, from the east came the red tide of the Soviet Union, and from the west, a wall of American steel moved relentlessly toward the heart of the Reich. In the towns and villages, people whispered the same words in dread and disbelief: Der Krieg ist verloren, the war is lost. But for the men at the front, especially those stationed along the crumbling western defenses, the meaning of those words was something far more personal. It meant a reckoning not only with defeat but with the truth about everything they had fought for. For years, German soldiers had been told that surrender was dishonor. They were raised under the creed of Sieg oder Tod, victory or death. To give oneself up to the enemy was, in the code of the Wehrmacht, a betrayal of the fatherland. Yet by 1945, this ideal had rotted from within. The high-sounding slogans of Nazi propaganda no longer matched the grim reality of the battlefields. Entire divisions were starving, cut off, and freezing. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, existed now only in fragments. The mighty panzer divisions that had thundered through Europe were shadows of their former selves, their tanks burned out, their engines dry of fuel. And still, Hitler demanded that they fight to the last man. The American advance, by contrast, was relentless but precise. Town after town fell without being reduced to rubble. Unlike the Soviets, the Americans rarely leveled a place just to take it. They surrounded, they outflanked, and then they offered a chance, the chance to surrender. Leaflets dropped from the sky by the millions urged the German soldier to lay down his arms, promising fair treatment, food, and safety. For many who had spent months starving in the trenches, these promises sounded almost unreal. But word spread quickly among the ranks: those who surrendered to the Americans lived. They were not executed. They were not beaten. They were not made to disappear. In the East, things were different, horribly different. The Red Army's vengeance for Stalingrad, Leningrad, and the millions of Soviet civilians massacred under German occupation had turned into a storm of retribution. Entire German villages were annihilated as the Soviets advanced into East Prussia. Civilians were shot, women assaulted, and prisoners executed. German soldiers who were captured alive were often marched eastward under conditions so brutal that most never returned. The memory of these atrocities spread westward faster than the Soviet tanks themselves. Every soldier who survived the Eastern Front carried stories that burned through the ranks like wildfire: "Don't let the Russians take you." By early March 1945, the Western Front became the only place left to escape the inevitable. The Rhine River, Germany's natural line of defense, was breached by the Americans with breathtaking speed. The crossing at Remagen stunned even the Allied commanders. The Germans had expected to blow up the Ludendorff Bridge before it could be captured, but the Americans seized it intact, flooding into the heart of Germany. For the German troops nearby, this moment shattered any illusion of defense. The war had entered the fatherland itself, and the enemy that now marched through their villages was not the barbaric invader of propaganda, it was a disciplined, efficient, and strangely impersonal force. It is in this context that mass surrender became not only logical but inevitable. German officers, who once swore unbreakable loyalty to Hitler, began to see the futility of resistance. Some tried to negotiate local ceasefires, surrendering their men to the Americans while still claiming to obey orders. Others simply vanished, leaving their soldiers to make the choice on their own. By the tens of thousands, they did. Columns of weary, hollow-eyed men marched westward with white flags, improvised from bed-sheets, shirts, and torn banners. When American troops encountered them, the reactions varied. Some U.S. soldiers were cautious, others almost indifferent. To many Americans, the sight of surrendering Germans was routine by that point. But to the Germans themselves, it was an act of profound transformation, from aggressors to supplicants, from conquerors to captives. They lined up, dropped their weapons, and raised their hands in silence. There were no grand speeches, no tears. Only relief. The fear that had haunted them, the fear of the Soviets, the fear of death, the fear of what they had become, was momentarily lifted. Inside the American-run prison camps, discipline and structure reappeared. The Germans were processed, identified, and fed. The food was simple: bread, soup, coffee, but to men who had not eaten properly in weeks, it felt like salvation. The guards were professional. There was no humiliation, no ritual of vengeance. The Americans did not spit on them, did not beat them, they simply recorded names, issued rations, and moved on. For many prisoners, this calm efficiency was the most shocking experience of all. After years of being taught that Americans were subhuman degenerates, they found themselves treated as men. The contrast between propaganda and reality broke something deep within the German psyche. For the first time, many of these soldiers began to question what they had been fighting for. They had been told that the Americans were weak and decadent, yet here was a nation that had crossed an ocean, defeated the mightiest armies in Europe, and done so with restraint. They had been told that the Aryan race was destined to rule the world, yet here they were, ruled by men who spoke a different language, wore foreign uniforms, and yet upheld a moral code that their own government had abandoned long ago. Historians often describe this phase as the moral collapse of the Wehrmacht, but to the men living it, it felt more like awakening from a nightmare. Many were young, barely 18 or 19, born into a world where Nazism was the only truth they knew. To be captured by Americans was to see that truth dissolve before their eyes. The myths of German invincibility, of racial superiority, of the eternal Reich, all were gone. In their place came something quieter but more enduring, the recognition that civilization, even in war, could exist without cruelty. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany, the surrender rate accelerated beyond anything seen in modern warfare. Whole corps laid down their arms without firing a shot. The statistics were staggering, hundreds of thousands in weeks. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared army in Europe, was dissolving into lines of prisoners stretching across fields and roadsides. The roads leading west were crowded with men desperate to reach American lines before the Russians did. Some stole bicycles or carts, others walked barefoot for miles, guided only by the distant sound of artillery and the promise of the stars and stripes. Even Hitler's orders to fight to the death could not stop it. His speeches, once electrifying, now sounded delusional. His generals no longer believed in victory, they believed in survival. The Führer demanded sacrifice, the soldiers demanded mercy. In those final weeks, Germany ceased to function as a nation. What remained were fragments, scattered units, broken commands, and men who no longer fought for ideology but for the chance to live through the storm. By April 1945, the surrender to Americans had become a flood. In Bavaria, along the Rhine, across the Ruhr Valley, hundreds of thousands streamed westward. The Americans built massive temporary camps, open-air enclosures where the sea of humanity gathered behind barbed wire. And yet, compared to the alternative, it was paradise. There were no summary executions, no vengeance, no terror in the night. For men who had seen the face of war for 6 years, the sight of American guards smoking cigarettes and sharing rations was the closest thing to peace they had known. The Wehrmacht had fought for conquest and found captivity. But in that captivity, they found something else, the first fragile glimpse of humanity returning after years of darkness. That, more than fear or defeat, explains why 500,000 German soldiers surrendered rather than face the Americans. Because in the cold logic of war, surrendering to a disciplined enemy was not cowardice. It was the last act of reason in a world that had gone mad. By the time April 1945 painted the skies of Germany in grey smoke and crimson sunsets, the Reich that had once promised 1,000 years of glory had been reduced to ashes. Cities that once symbolized German power, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, lay in ruins. The mighty Wehrmacht, which had once stormed across Europe with precision and pride, was now a fractured army of ghosts. The fanatical dream of Hitler's empire had died, and with it died the faith of millions who had believed in its invincibility. Yet amidst the chaos and the dust, something remarkable was happening. German soldiers were surrendering to Americans in unprecedented numbers, not with hatred, but with relief, a silent acknowledgement that the nightmare was over. To understand this wave of surrender, one must look deeper than tactics or logistics. It was not merely fear of Soviet revenge or the collapse of supply lines. It was something spiritual, the breaking of a faith, the disillusionment of an entire generation. For years, German soldiers had been indoctrinated to believe that they were fighting for civilization against barbarism, that the Reich was the last bastion of order in a chaotic world. But now, as the Americans advanced, the illusion reversed itself. The German soldier saw in the American lines something his own nation had lost: discipline without cruelty, strength without fanaticism, and unity without tyranny. The encounters between the surrendering Germans and their American captors often carried an air of quiet tragedy. Many of the prisoners were young boys, the so-called Volkssturm, teenage conscripts sent into battle with outdated rifles and trembling hands. Others were veterans who had fought since Poland or France, their faces hardened by 6 years of war. When they were disarmed, there was no resistance. The Americans would order them to drop their weapons, line up, and march to the rear. Some would even salute before surrendering, an instinct left over from an era of rigid military honor. In those gestures lay an unspoken admission, that the war they had fought so fiercely was no longer theirs to control. American officers who processed the prisoners noted something peculiar: the Germans seemed almost grateful. They answered questions politely, obeyed orders promptly, and in many cases expressed relief at being captured. One U.S. captain described it later: it was like watching men waking from hypnosis. The ideology that had once possessed them, the blind devotion to Führer and fatherland, had been shattered not by propaganda, but by experience. The power of the Nazi myth had depended on the illusion of victory. Once defeat became undeniable, the myth dissolved. What remained were human beings, exhausted, frightened, and yearning for normalcy. The American treatment of prisoners reinforced this transformation. Unlike the Eastern Front, where brutality reigned, the Americans adhered to the Geneva Conventions with precision. German soldiers were given identification tags, medical attention, and rations, the same rations, in many cases, that American troops received. For men who had spent months starving, this fairness was incomprehensible. The idea that the enemy would feed you, protect you, and treat you with respect contradicted everything they had been taught. To many Germans, it was their first experience of the values that democracy claimed to stand for. This encounter with American civilization, through its army, its organization, and its restraint, began to reshape the consciousness of those who survived. Captured German officers often commented on the Americans' efficiency and material abundance. They saw the vast supply convoys, the endless streams of trucks and tanks, the well-fed soldiers with fresh uniforms, the cigarettes, the music, the photographs from home. It was a glimpse of another world, one powered not by ideology, but by industry and freedom. The contrast was overwhelming. While Germany's cities starved under the weight of its own lies, the Americans represented a society that thrived through unity rather than obedience. For many German soldiers, surrendering to the Americans was more than survival, it was a passage into that other world. Even in captivity, they sensed a strange dignity returning. They were no longer cogs in a machine of conquest. They were simply men again. The American-run prisoner-of-war camps were austere but orderly. There were no executions, no revenge killings. Work details were organized, medical care provided, and letters were allowed to be sent home. It was not freedom, but it was civilization, something that Germany itself had lost in the madness of total war. The moral dimension of this surrender is often overlooked, but it may be the most important. When 500,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Americans, they were not only admitting military defeat, they were renouncing the ideological war their leaders had started. It was a collective act of rejection, even if unspoken. Each man who laid down his rifle and walked into captivity was, in his own quiet way, refusing to die for a lie. They no longer believed in victory. They no longer believed in Hitler. And for the first time in years, they began to believe in something else, survival, peace, and perhaps redemption. This surrender, however, was not without its complexities. Not all Americans were saints, and not all German prisoners were innocent. There were moments of tension, acts of cruelty, and breakdowns of order, inevitable in the chaos of a collapsing world. Yet compared to the annihilation awaiting them in the East, the American captivity felt almost merciful. And so the streams of surrender continued, each convoy of prisoners a silent confession of defeat and relief. The psychological transformation of these men would later become a foundation for something larger, the rebuilding of Germany itself. When the war ended, and many of these prisoners were released, they carried with them memories of that encounter with American power, not just its weapons, but its order, its humanity, and its discipline. They had seen that strength need not be cruel, and that the victor could be just. In the years to come, as West Germany rose from the ashes under American guidance, that memory would shape an entire generation. But in the spring of 1945, that future was still far away. In that moment, there was only exhaustion. The German army was dissolving, Hitler was trapped in his bunker, and the land itself was dying. The sound of surrender echoed across the countryside, boots crunching on roads, rifles clattering into piles, flags turned white. The Americans took in prisoners faster than they could count them. And in those endless lines of gray-clad men walking westward, there was no more hate, no more ideology. Only resignation, and, perhaps, the faint beginning of understanding. Because in the end, the story of those 500,000 men is not only a story of defeat. It is a story of awakening. They had been taught that the world beyond Germany was their enemy, that democracy was weakness, that freedom was chaos. Yet when they met the Americans, they saw a different truth, that power without hatred was possible, and that civilization, even in war, could still hold its humanity. By May 1945, Germany was a nation in ruin. The great cities that once embodied the pride of the Reich were nothing but silent graveyards of stone and ash. The rivers were choked with the wreckage of bridges, the railways twisted into useless iron. Smoke still rose from the rubble of Berlin, where the Führer's madness had ended in a bunker beneath the earth, not in triumph, but in suicide. The dream of empire was gone, and in its place stood only devastation and disbelief. Yet amid this ruin, one extraordinary fact emerged: hundreds of thousands of German soldiers had laid down their arms before the Americans. It was more than a surrender. It was a collective act of survival, an instinctive recognition that to live under American power was to be spared from annihilation. The scale of that surrender was unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. Entire armies ceased to exist in a matter of days. From the Ruhr pocket to Bavaria, the Americans accepted columns of prisoners so vast that their own supply system struggled to feed them. The photographs from that time are haunting: endless lines of gray-uniformed men marching silently under the watchful eyes of young American soldiers, their rifles slung casually, their faces tired but calm. The victors did not gloat, the defeated did not resist. It was as though both sides understood that the world they had known was ending, and something new, uncertain but necessary, was beginning. For the Germans, this act of surrender carried meanings that reached beyond the battlefield. To surrender to the Americans was to surrender to a different kind of civilization, one built not on racial destiny or ideological purity, but on law, industry, and democracy. The American army, though a force of destruction in war, was also a force of order in peace. Its soldiers built bridges, restored power stations, fed civilians, and imposed discipline without cruelty. The German people, dazed and starving, saw in this occupying power a strange paradox: conquerors who rebuilt what they had destroyed. In those early months after the war, this paradox became the seed of transformation. To many German soldiers, the American treatment of captives was the first crack of light after years of darkness. They had been told that the enemy would enslave or annihilate them. Instead, they found themselves housed, fed, and organized. Of course, not every camp was humane, some were overcrowded, some chaotic, but compared to the eastern camps or the horrors of the Soviet Gulag, the difference was immeasurable. The Americans, for all their power, still recognized the humanity of those they had defeated. And for a generation of Germans who had grown up under a regime that worshipped death and obedience, this recognition was quietly revolutionary. The psychological weight of this surrender cannot be overstated. To the German soldier, it meant letting go of everything he had been told was sacred: the oath to Hitler, the pride of the Wehrmacht, the illusion of invincibility. Yet in that surrender lay the first act of moral freedom. By choosing life over ideology, by walking toward the Americans instead of fighting to the end, these men rejected the lie that had consumed their country. It was, in its own way, the first step toward Germany's rebirth. For the Americans, the sight of these vast surrenders was also instructive. Many had expected fierce resistance to the last breath, yet what they found instead was exhaustion, even relief. The U.S. Army, trained for total war, was suddenly faced with the reality of total collapse, an enemy that no longer wanted to fight. Young American soldiers, many no older than 20, found themselves guarding tens of thousands of men twice their age. Some pitied them, others despised them, but most simply carried out their duties with the same efficiency that had carried them through the war. In the end, it was not vengeance that defined the American victory, but control, a disciplined, industrialized, democratic form of power that had proven stronger than fanaticism. In the months that followed, as Europe began to rebuild, the legacy of those surrenders became clear. The 500,000 German soldiers who had chosen the Americans had not only saved their lives, they had preserved something else: the possibility of a future for their nation. When the Cold War emerged and Germany was divided, it was in the American-occupied zone that democracy took root again. The same soldiers who had once marched in the name of tyranny now lived under the rule of law, and many of them, consciously or not, carried within them the memory of the day they chose not to die for a dead idea. The story of why 500,000 German soldiers surrendered rather than face the Americans is therefore not only a story of fear, it is a story of recognition. They recognized in their enemy a power that was not merely military, but moral, a power grounded in reason, discipline, and respect for order. The Americans represented something that Germany itself had once aspired to before it lost its soul, a civilization built on strength without cruelty, on freedom without chaos. In their surrender, the Germans acknowledged that difference. And though it came too late to save their country from ruin, it became the foundation upon which a new Germany could rise. When historians speak of the end of the Second World War, they often focus on the great battles, the political decisions, the leaders who shaped the course of history. But behind those vast movements were men, ordinary soldiers who, in the final days of the war, made a simple, human choice, to live. To lay down their weapons, to step out of the madness, and to trust their fate to an enemy who, in that moment, seemed more civilized than theirs. The psychological transformation of these men would later become a foundation for something larger, the rebuilding of Germany itself. When the war ended, and many of these prisoners were released, they carried with them memories of that encounter with American power, not just its weapons, but its order, its humanity, and its discipline. They had seen that strength need not be cruel, and that the victor could be just. In the years to come, as West Germany rose from the ashes under American guidance, that memory would shape an entire generation. But in the spring of 1945, that future was still far away. In that moment, there was only exhaustion. The German army was dissolving, Hitler was trapped in his bunker, and the land itself was dying. The sound of surrender echoed across the countryside, boots crunching on roads, rifles clattering into piles, flags turned white. The Americans took in prisoners faster than they could count them. And in those endless lines of gray-clad men walking westward, there was no more hate, no more ideology. Only resignation, and, perhaps, the faint beginning of understanding. Because in the end, the story of those 500,000 men is not only a story of defeat. It is a story of awakening. They had been taught that the world beyond Germany was their enemy, that democracy was weakness, that freedom was chaos. Yet when they met the Americans, they saw a different truth, that power without hatred was possible, and that civilization, even in war, could still hold its humanity. Own rulers. In that choice, quiet and uncelebrated, lies one of the most profound truths of the 20th century, that sometimes, surrender is not defeat, but the beginning of redemption. And so, in the ruins of Germany, beneath the distant sound of Allied aircraft and the echo of collapsing walls, the war finally ended not with a roar, but with silence, the silence of boots marching westward, of rifles dropped into the mud, of men looking for the first time at a future beyond ideology. The Americans had shown them a different kind of power, not the power of terror, but the power of civilization itself. And that, more than any weapon or victory, is why 500,000 German soldiers surrendered rather than face the Americans.